A young man walks into court expecting justice. Instead, he's met with laughter. The judge mocks him. The opposing attorney dismisses him. The courtroom sees him as nothing more than an inexperienced lawyer, completely out of his depth. But they have no idea who they're dealing with. What starts as a simple lawsuit quickly unravels into a shocking case of fraud, corruption, and deception at the highest levels. With every twist, the courtroom shifts, and the people who once laughed begin to realize the truth. This so-called amateur isn't just any lawyer. He's a federal prosecutor, and he's about to expose secrets that some would do anything to keep buried. Will justice prevail? Or will power and influence win once again? Stay tuned to find out, and if you love gripping courtroom dramas filled with unexpected twists, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a case like this. Like the video, drop a comment, and let us know where you're watching from. The courtroom was buzzing with low murmurs as Ethan Carter, a young man in his late 20s, walked toward the defendant's table. He looked out of place. His slightly wrinkled gray suit was a size too big. His brown hair was casually swept to the side, and he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. But to everyone else in the courtroom, he looked unimpressive. Judge Randall Thornton, a man known for his sharp tongue and impatience, adjusted his glasses and sighed. "Mr. Carter, you do realize this is a courtroom, not a college debate club, right?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. The court clerk, attorneys, and even some spectators chuckled. Ethan didn't react. He simply nodded and placed a folder on the table. Across from him, James Holloway, a seasoned attorney with decades of experience, smirked. "This should be interesting," he muttered, leaning toward his client, a wealthy businessman named Gerald Winston. The case seemed straightforward. Winston was suing a former employee, claiming the man had stolen company documents. Ethan, the so-called rookie lawyer, had somehow been assigned to defend the accused. No one expected much. Judge Thornton tapped his gavel. "Let's proceed." Mr. Holloway, opening statement. Holloway stood, buttoning his expensive navy blue suit. "Your Honor, members of the court, this is a clear case of corporate theft. The defendant, Mr. Lewis, was caught in possession of confidential documents belonging to my client's company. He was terminated, and now, instead of admitting his wrongdoing, he has brought in, well, let's just say, unconventional representation." He gestured toward Ethan with a smirk. The courtroom chuckled again. Ethan remained silent, letting the moment pass. Judge Thornton turned to him. "Mr. Carter, do you have an opening statement, or are you still trying to find the right words?" Another round of laughter. Ethan finally stood. "Your Honor, I have a few words, but I prefer to let the facts speak for themselves." He walked to the table, opened his folder, and pulled out a document. "Before I proceed, I would like to submit this as evidence." Holloway frowned. "What is this? Some printout from the internet?" Judge Thornton took the document, glanced at it, then paused. His amused expression flickered into something unreadable. He leaned forward, reading more carefully. The courtroom, sensing a shift in energy, fell silent. Then, in a tone much less sarcastic than before, the judge asked, "Where did you get this?" Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "From the Department of Justice Archives, Your Honor." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Holloway straightened in his seat, looking concerned for the first time. Judge Thornton glanced at Ethan again, his curiosity piqued. "And how exactly did you manage that?" Ethan allowed a small, knowing smile. "Because, Your Honor, I work there." Dead silence. Judge Thornton's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. "Ethan Carter, Assistant Federal Prosecutor." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Holloway's smirk disappeared. Even Winston, the confident businessman, paled. Judge Thornton leaned back in his chair, the mockery in his tone gone. "You're telling me that the defense counsel in this case is a federal prosecutor?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And I'm here because this case isn't just about corporate theft. It's about corruption, fraud, and a whole lot of lies. The courtroom was no longer laughing. A heavy silence blanketed the courtroom. The air, once filled with laughter and condescension, now carried only tension. Judge Thornton's skeptical expression had vanished, replaced by cautious intrigue. Across the courtroom, James Holloway's confidence flickered. Even Gerald Winston, who had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy victory, now looked uncomfortable in his chair. Judge Thornton tapped his gavel lightly. "Mr. Carter, let me be absolutely clear. You're claiming that this case, one that appears to be a standard corporate dispute, actually involves corruption." Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." He stepped forward, placing another document on the judge's desk. "This is a Department of Justice investigation summary outlining fraudulent financial activity within Mr. Winston's company. Transactions that were conveniently erased from internal records, except for one person who noticed the inconsistencies, my client, Mr. Lewis." The courtroom gasped. Holloway bolted upright. "Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous. My client is not on trial here." Judge Thornton held up a hand. "Mr. Holloway, sit down." His eyes narrowed as he examined the document Ethan had submitted. Then, with slow precision, he set the paper aside and leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, you're making serious allegations. You better be prepared to back them up." Ethan remained steady. "I intend to." Holloway exhaled sharply, regaining his composure. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to distract from the real issue. Mr. Lewis was caught with stolen documents. That is the case before the court." Ethan turned toward him, finally engaging directly. "Mr. Holloway, let's talk about those stolen documents." He walked toward the evidence table and held up a USB drive. "This drive contains encrypted financial records, ones that were flagged as irregular by your client's own accounting software. Mr. Lewis didn't steal them, he copied them because he suspected wrongdoing." Winston, who had remained silent until now, clenched his jaw. His fingers tapped anxiously on the desk. Ethan continued, "And here's the most interesting part. The records he saved, they no longer exist on your company's servers. Someone erased them. Would you care to explain that?" Holloway's mouth opened, but no words came. Judge Thornton looked unimpressed. "Mr. Holloway?" Holloway straightened his tie. "Your Honor, this is speculation. There is no proof that my client had anything to do with." Ethan cut him off. "Your Honor, may I call a witness?" The judge arched an eyebrow. "You want to call a witness now?" "Yes, Your Honor. The court needs to hear from someone who can confirm what I just said." Judge Thornton considered for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed." Ethan turned to the courtroom doors. "I call Mr. Eric Dawson to the stand." The doors opened, and a middle-aged man in a navy suit stepped inside. The moment Winston saw him, his face turned pale. The reaction didn't go unnoticed by the judge. Dawson took his seat at the witness stand, swearing in before facing Ethan. "Mr. Dawson," Ethan said, "could you please state your occupation for the court?" "I'm the head of IT security at Winston Enterprises." "And are you familiar with the encrypted files in question?" Dawson hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I am." Ethan leaned in slightly. "Tell the court what happened to them." Dawson shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Winston, who sat frozen in his chair. Finally, he exhaled. "The files were deleted remotely. Not by Mr. Lewis. By someone with high-level access." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Ethan turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe the court now sees why this case isn't what it appears to be." Judge Thornton steepled his fingers. "I see that very clearly, Mr. Carter." His gaze moved to Winston. "And I suspect we've only just scratched the surface." The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Judge Thornton's piercing gaze lingered on Gerald Winston, whose usually composed demeanor was unraveling by the second. James Holloway, once brimming with confidence, now sat rigid, gripping his pen as though it were a lifeline. Ethan Carter didn't rush. He let the weight of Eric Dawson's words settle. The court had just heard that Winston Enterprises' financial records weren't stolen, they were erased from the inside. Someone was trying to hide something. Judge Thornton exhaled, his fingers tapping the bench. Mr. Dawson, you stated that the files were deleted remotely. Who had the access to do that? Dawson swallowed hard. Only 3 people had that level of clearance. Myself, the CFO, he hesitated, glancing at Winston. And Mr. Winston himself. A collective murmur swept through the courtroom. Ethan took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Dawson, were you the one who deleted the files? No, sir. Was the CFO? Dawson shifted uncomfortably. No, Ethan let the silence stretch before speaking. So that leaves only one person. He turned toward Winston. Mr. Winston, would you like to explain why the files related to fraudulent financial activity disappeared under your watch? Holloway shot up. Objection. This is a civil case, not a criminal investigation. Mr. Carter is trying to turn this courtroom into a federal inquisition. Judge Thornton waved a hand. Overruled. Mr. Carter is simply presenting facts. If those facts happen to raise legal concerns, that's not his fault, Mr. Holloway. Winston finally spoke, his voice forced and measured. This is ridiculous. My company has nothing to hide. Those files must have been deleted by mistake. Ethan smiled slightly. A mistake? The files related specifically to fraudulent transactions, flagged by your own system, and they vanished just as my client, Mr. Lewis, started asking questions. That's an awfully convenient mistake. Winston's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Ethan turned back to Dawson. Tell the court, Mr. Dawson, was there any attempt to recover the deleted files? Dawson hesitated again. Yes. But he glanced at Winston before continuing. When we tried, we discovered they had been overwritten with random data. Someone didn't just delete them, they made sure they were gone for good. Gasps spread through the spectators. Holloway looked like he wanted to be anywhere but inside that courtroom. Judge Thornton leaned forward, his patience thinning. Mr. Carter, do you have anything further to add? Ethan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to submit a subpoena request. The judge arched an eyebrow. For what? Ethan lifted another document. For Winston Enterprises' full financial records, including backup server logs. If Mr. Winston has nothing to hide, then he should have no issue providing them. Holloway's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. Absolutely not. This is beyond the scope of this case. My client is the one bringing the lawsuit, and now we're the ones being put on trial. Judge Thornton's gaze hardened. Mr. Holloway, I'll be the one who decides what's relevant in my courtroom. He turned to Ethan. Your request is granted. Winston Enterprises will produce the requested documents within 48 hours. Winston's expression darkened. Your Honor, this is absurd, the judge's gavel struck. That is my ruling, Mr. Winston. If your company is as clean as you claim, then you have nothing to worry about. Ethan met Winston's glare without flinching. He had cracked the surface. Now it was time to dig deeper. The courtroom had started as a place where he was mocked. Now it was a battlefield and he was winning. The courtroom had transformed. Where there was once laughter at Ethan Carter's expense, there was now tension thick enough to choke. Judge Thornton's ruling was clear. Gerald Winston had 48 hours to produce his company's financial records. But everyone in the courtroom knew the truth. If those records ever saw daylight, Winston's empire could crumble. Winston shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of the plaintiff's table. His attorney, James Holloway, leaned in and whispered something urgently, but Winston barely reacted. He was too busy staring at Ethan, the so-called inexperienced lawyer who had flipped the entire case on its head. Ethan stood calmly, watching. He wasn't arrogant, wasn't celebrating. He knew this wasn't over. Winston was cornered, and cornered men were dangerous. Judge Thornton adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Now that we have addressed the financial records, let's return to the matter at hand. Mr. Holloway, does your client wish to proceed with his claim against Mr. Lewis, or would he prefer to withdraw? Holloway stood, regaining some of his composure. Your Honor, my client wishes to proceed. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Ethan wasn't surprised. Winston couldn't back down now. It would be an admission of guilt. Judge Thornton nodded. Very well. We will reconvene in 2 days after the subpoenaed documents have been presented. Until then, court is adjourned. The gavel struck. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Holloway, his usual smugness replaced with quiet calculation. You're making a mistake, Carter, Holloway said, voice low. You don't know who you're dealing with. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Then maybe you should tell me. Holloway smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Let's just say some cases never make it to a verdict. Ethan held his gaze. And some lawyers never recover from backing the wrong client. Holloway's smirk faltered. Without another word, he turned and strode toward Winston, who was already making his way out of the courtroom. Ethan exhaled slowly. He knew a threat when he heard one. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, legal analysts, and curious spectators filled every seat. The atmosphere was electric. Everyone wanted to know if Winston Enterprises would comply with the subpoena. Ethan sat at the defense table, reviewing his notes. Beside him, his client, Daniel Lewis, fidgeted nervously. What if they didn't hand over the records? Lewis whispered. Ethan glanced at the plaintiff's table. Winston sat stiffly, his face unreadable. Holloway, however, looked unusually composed. That was never a good sign. We'll find out soon, Ethan murmured. Judge Thornton entered, and the room stood. As soon as everyone was seated, he wasted no time. Mr. Holloway, does your client have the requested documents? Holloway stood smoothly. Your Honor, my client has done everything in his power to retrieve the records, but unfortunately he paused, feigning regret. There was a catastrophic server failure. The documents no longer exist. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's grip on his pen tightened. He had expected resistance, but this was bold. Judge Thornton's expression darkened. You're telling this court that conveniently, every requested financial record was lost. Holloway nodded. A tragic accident, Your Honor. Ethan rose. Your Honor, I'd like to request an immediate forensic investigation into Winston Enterprises servers. Deleted files can be recovered. Winston finally spoke, his voice laced with frustration. With all due respect, Your Honor, my company has been fully cooperative. This is nothing more than a witch hunt. Judge Thornton tapped his gavel once. Enough. Mr. Carter's request is valid. A forensic team will be assigned. If there was any intentional destruction of evidence, this court will know. Ethan caught the brief flicker of panic in Winston's eyes. He had just lost control of the game. And Ethan wasn't finished yet. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of justice, it felt like a battlefield. And Ethan Carter knew exactly what kind of war he was fighting. Gerald Winston had just played his boldest move yet, claiming that a mysterious server failure had erased every single financial record tied to the subpoena. A convenient accident. Judge Thornton's face was unreadable, but Ethan knew the judge wasn't buying it. No one was. Very well, Judge Thornton said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. A forensic investigation will be conducted to determine whether this was, in fact, an accident or a deliberate act of evidence destruction. Until then, we proceed. His gaze shifted to Ethan. Mr. Carter, do you have any additional evidence to present at this time? Ethan rose slowly. Yes, Your Honor. He walked toward the evidence table, his footsteps deliberate, controlled. The court was watching his every move. Since Mr. Winston's financial records have been conveniently lost, I'd like to introduce a different set of records. He placed a folder on the table and slid it toward the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Thornton. These are financial statements from an external auditing firm that worked with Winston Enterprises last year. Unlike the internal documents that were deleted, these records still exist. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. At the plaintiff's table, Winston's fingers curled into a fist. Holloway stood, his face carefully neutral. Your Honor, these documents were not part of the original discovery request. How can we verify their authenticity? Ethan didn't miss a beat. The auditing firm has already certified them, and I have a witness who can verify their contents. Judge Thornton adjusted his glasses. Proceed. Ethan turned toward the courtroom doors. I call Ms. Rachel Monroe to the stand. The doors swung open, and a tall woman in a navy blazer walked in. Her presence alone commanded attention. She strode to the witness stand, took her oath, and sat. Ethan stepped forward. Ms. Monroe, could you state your occupation for the court? I'm a forensic accountant. My firm was hired to audit Winston Enterprises last year. Ethan nodded. And what did you find during your audit? Monroe's expression was calm, professional. There were numerous financial irregularities. Money being moved through offshore accounts, invoices that didn't match expenditures. It appeared that funds were being funneled out of the company in a way that suggested fraud. A collective murmur swept through the courtroom. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to see Winston's face. The man looked like he was barely keeping his temper in check. I see, Ethan continued. And were these findings ever reported? Yes, Monroe said. We filed a preliminary report and submitted our concerns to Winston Enterprises' leadership team. Ethan leaned in slightly. And who was on that team? Monroe hesitated before answering. The CFO and Mr. Gerald Winston. The courtroom erupted in hushed conversation. Judge Thornton's voice cut through the noise. Silence. He turned to Winston. Mr. Winston, do you have anything to say regarding this testimony? Winston stood abruptly. This is absurd. Ms. Monroe's firm was dismissed from our account. Their report was incomplete and full of errors. Ethan raised an eyebrow. If the report was full of errors, then why were those specific records among the ones that were accidentally deleted? Winston had no answer. Judge Thornton tapped his gavel. Enough. This court will take a recess before we proceed further. Ethan sat down as the courtroom buzzed with energy. He had just taken another piece off the board, and soon he'd cornered the king. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal proceedings. It was a crucible, burning away falsehoods to reveal the truth. And Ethan Carter knew they were close. Too close for Gerald Winston's comfort. As the court reconvened after the recess, Judge Thornton wasted no time. He adjusted his glasses, his gaze sharp as he looked toward the plaintiff's table. Mr. Winston, you've now heard testimony that financial irregularities existed within your company and that your team was made aware of them. Would you like to respond? Winston straightened in his seat. Though his suit remained immaculate, his composure had begun to crack. He forced a tight smile. Your Honor, Ms. Monroe's so-called findings were speculative at best. My company reviewed her claims, found them unsubstantiated, and chose not to pursue them. Ethan didn't flinch. He was waiting for that answer. Judge Thornton nodded slowly. Then I assume you won't object to us verifying that with your company's current CFO? Winston hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was all Ethan needed. Actually, Your Honor, Ethan said, standing, the defense has already reached out to Winston Enterprises' former CFO, and we'd like to call him as our next witness. Winston's head snapped toward him. Holloway muttered something under his breath. Judge Thornton tapped his gavel. Proceed. Ethan turned to the doors. The defense calls Mr. Robert Kessler to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom as the doors opened. A man in his early 50s, his hair graying at the temples, entered. He wore a simple suit, his expression unreadable. But as he made his way to the witness stand, Ethan noticed the way Winston clenched his jaw. Kessler took his oath, then sat. Ethan approached. "Mr. Kessler, could you state your previous position for the court?" "I was the chief financial officer of Winston Enterprises." "For how long?" 10 years. Ethan nodded. "And can you confirm whether Ms. Monroe's audit findings were ever brought to your attention?" Kessler exhaled, then nodded. "Yes. I received the report." Ethan took a step closer. "And what did you do with it?" Kessler glanced at Winston, then looked down at his hands. "I prepared a full internal review. My team confirmed that the transactions in question were highly suspicious." The courtroom murmured. Judge Thornton didn't intervene. He wanted to hear this as much as anyone. Ethan let the moment settle before asking, "And what happened next?" Kessler hesitated. His fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair. "Mr. Kessler," Ethan said carefully, "were you instructed to bury the findings?" A long silence stretched through the courtroom. Then, finally, Kessler lifted his gaze. "Yes." A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Judge Thornton leaned forward. "By whom?" Kessler swallowed hard. "By Gerald Winston." Chaos erupted. The courtroom exploded into whispers and shocked exclamations. Judge Thornton's gavel came down hard. "Order. I will have order in this court." Ethan remained still, watching Winston. The man's face had gone completely pale. Judge Thornton turned to Winston, his voice heavy with expectation. "Mr. Winston, do you have anything to say in response to this testimony?" Winston opened his mouth, but for the first time since the trial began, no words came out. Ethan sat down, satisfied. The court wasn't laughing anymore. They were witnessing the unraveling of a powerful man. And Ethan was about to deliver the final blow. The courtroom had become a spectacle of disbelief. Gerald Winston, once the untouchable businessman, sat frozen, his carefully built defense crumbling in front of everyone. The admission from Robert Kessler, the former CFO of Winston Enterprises, that he had been instructed to bury evidence of fraud had shattered any illusion of innocence. Judge Thornton's gaze burned into Winston. "Mr. Winston, this is your last opportunity to respond before I take action." James Holloway, looking unusually shaken, leaned over and whispered furiously into Winston's ear. The businessman's fingers twitched, his jaw tightening. Then slowly he stood. "Your Honor," Winston began, his voice measured but strained, "these are baseless accusations from disgruntled former employees. Mr. Kessler lost his position due to poor performance. His testimony is nothing more than an attempt to discredit me." Ethan Carter leaned back slightly, listening. He had expected Winston to fight back, but the cracks in his confidence were obvious. Judge Thornton sighed. "Is that your final response?" Winston nodded stiffly. Ethan stood. "Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce one final piece of evidence." Winston's head snapped toward him. Holloway visibly stiffened. Judge Thornton gestured for him to continue. "Proceed, Mr. Carter." Ethan walked to the evidence table and held up a small flash drive. "This, Your Honor, is a copy of Winston Enterprises' off-site backup records, retrieved from an independent data security firm." A murmur swept through the room. Winston's face went deathly pale. Holloway shot up from his chair. "Objection. There is no proof that these records are authentic." Ethan remained unfazed. "The data security firm has already verified the contents, and I have a witness from the firm prepared to testify." Judge Thornton studied Ethan, then turned to Holloway. "Unless you have a legal basis for preventing this evidence, I see no reason why we shouldn't proceed." Holloway hesitated, then slowly sank back into his chair. He had no argument left to make. Ethan handed the flash drive to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Thornton plugged it into a laptop in front of him, scanning the screen. His expression darkened. Your Honor, Ethan continued, the recovered files contain transaction logs proving that Mr. Winston was moving company funds through shell corporations. They also contain an internal memo sent by Mr. Winston himself ordering the deletion of these exact records after Mr. Lewis raised concerns. A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Judge Thornton looked up. His voice, calm but heavy, shattered the air. Mr. Winston, do you deny writing this memo? Winston opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The judge exhaled sharply and turned to the bailiff. Bailiff, contact federal authorities. I am ordering an immediate inquiry into Mr. Winston's business dealings. Winston lurched forward. Your Honor, this is outrageous. You have no right. Thornton slammed his gavel. You don't tell me what I have the right to do in my courtroom, Mr. Winston. You have spent this entire trial lying, deceiving, and manipulating evidence. This court does not exist to protect the powerful, it exists to serve justice. Ethan folded his hands. He had done it. As Winston sat back, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, the weight of the courtroom's judgment pressed down on him. The walls were closing in, and Ethan Carter had just delivered the final nail in his coffin. The courtroom had become a place of reckoning. The once mighty Gerald Winston, a man who had walked into court expecting an easy victory, now sat cornered, his empire on the brink of collapse. Judge Thornton's decision to order an immediate federal inquiry into Winston Enterprises sent shockwaves through the room. The court reporters' pens scratched furiously against their notepads, and the murmurs among spectators had turned into a hushed, electrified silence. Ethan Carter remained standing, his expression calm. He had spent the last several days being underestimated, mocked, and dismissed. But now, the court was hanging on to his every word. Judge Thornton's voice cut through the silence. Bailiff, ensure that the Department of Justice receives these recovered records immediately. If these files contain what Mr. Carter claims, this goes far beyond a simple civil case. The bailiff nodded and exited swiftly. James Holloway, now looking like a man drowning in quicksand, shot to his feet. Your Honor, I must object to this entire proceeding. This case is about an alleged theft of documents, and now we're suddenly treating my client as if he's on trial for a crime. Judge Thornton's eyes flashed. Mr. Holloway, I am treating your client exactly as he deserves to be treated. I will not tolerate deception in my courtroom. Holloway clenched his jaw, but sat back down. Winston, however, was not as composed. His fists tightened, and his breathing had become shallow. Ethan could tell he was unraveling. Ethan turned toward Winston and took a slow step forward. Mr. Winston, he said, his voice even, you came into this courtroom expecting to bury my client under a false lawsuit. You thought you could manipulate the court, erase evidence, and walk away untouchable. He tilted his head slightly. How does it feel knowing that the court now sees the truth? Winston shot out of his chair. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? He spat. You're just a kid playing lawyer. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The courtroom went completely silent. Every eye turned toward Winston. Judge Thornton's gavel slammed down. Mr. Winston, sit down. And I suggest you choose your next words carefully. But Winston wasn't finished. His eyes burned with fury as he pointed at Ethan. You think this is over? You have no idea the kind of power I have. You think the court will stop me? You think the DOJ will stop me? He let out a bitter laugh. I've been dealing with politicians and federal agents for years. You are nothing. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Winston had just made a fatal mistake. Judge Thornton's expression darkened. His voice, once sharp with authority, now carried something colder. Mr. Winston, I strongly suggest you stop talking before you further incriminate yourself. Ethan, however, remained still, watching Winston's meltdown with quiet calculation. He didn't need to say anything. Winston was digging his own grave. The doors to the courtroom swung open. A team of federal agents entered, led by a man in a crisp navy blue suit. He walked with the unmistakable air of authority. The courtroom parted as he strode forward. The agent pulled out a folder and approached the judge. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Daniel Monroe with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We received the court's request for an investigation." He glanced at Winston. "And after reviewing the submitted evidence, we are prepared to take Mr. Winston into custody for obstruction of justice and financial fraud." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Winston's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't do this." Judge Thornton leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Winston, the court disagrees." Two agents moved in. Winston instinctively stepped back, but there was nowhere left to run. The power he had wielded for so long had crumbled in the face of justice. As the agents placed handcuffs around Winston's wrists, Ethan finally spoke. "Mr. Winston, you were right about one thing." Winston turned, his glare full of hatred. Ethan's expression remained calm. "Some cases never make it to a verdict, because the truth speaks for itself." The courtroom watched as Gerald Winston was led away. And for the first time since the trial began, Ethan Carter allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Justice had spoken. The courtroom remained frozen, as if the very walls were still absorbing what had just transpired. Gerald Winston, once a man of power and influence, had been led away in handcuffs. The echo of his final protests had faded, replaced by the hum of whispered conversations, the rustling of papers, and the tapping of hurried courtroom reporters chronicling history in real time. Ethan Carter sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His client, Daniel Lewis, looked at him with wide eyes. "Did that really just happen?" he whispered. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it did." Judge Thornton rapped his gavel, restoring order. His gaze swept over the courtroom before settling on Ethan. "Mr. Carter, it appears that this case has taken a rather unexpected turn. However, there is still the matter of the original claim. The court needs to decide whether Mr. Lewis was, in fact, guilty of stealing company documents." Ethan stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, I would argue that Mr. Lewis did not steal anything. He retained copies of financial records that were already part of the company's system documents that he had legitimate access to as an employee." He turned slightly, addressing the court. "And as we now know, these documents contained evidence of fraud. Mr. Lewis did not take them for personal gain. He took them because he feared that they would be destroyed to cover up corruption." Judge Thornton considered this for a long moment. Then he turned to James Holloway, the last remaining piece of Winston's shattered legal team. "Mr. Holloway, given the circumstances, does your client still wish to pursue this lawsuit?" Holloway was silent. He looked like a man whose entire world had just been rewritten in real time. His once meticulous notes were now worthless, his carefully planned arguments now irrelevant. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he cleared his throat and stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stiff but resigned, "given recent developments, my client's case is no longer viable. We withdraw our claims." A wave of relief washed over Daniel Lewis's face. He turned to Ethan. "We won?" Ethan smiled slightly. "We won." Judge Thornton nodded. "Very well. The court officially dismisses the case against Mr. Lewis. This court is adjourned." He struck his gavel one final time. The moment the words left his mouth, the courtroom erupted not in chaos, but in pure energy. Reporters rushed toward the front, eager to get statements. Spectators buzzed with excitement. Lawyers exchanged knowing glances, understanding that they had just witnessed something rare. Not just a victory, but a complete dismantling of power and corruption in real time. Ethan turned to Daniel, shaking his hand firmly. "You did the right thing by holding onto those documents. And now the truth is out." Daniel let out a breathy laugh, still in disbelief. "I can't believe this. I thought this trial would ruin me, and now," he shook his head. "Now it's Winston who's going to prison." Ethan nodded. Justice has a funny way of working itself out. Before he could say more, a voice called from behind. Mr. Carter. He turned to find Judge Thornton approaching, his expression unreadable. Ethan straightened instinctively. The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. I misjudged you. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. Judge Thornton sighed. I assumed you were just some inexperienced lawyer who had wandered into the wrong courtroom. Instead, you handled yourself with skill, restraint, and precision. Not bad for a kid playing lawyer. His eyes glinted with something almost resembling humor. Ethan chuckled. I appreciate that, Your Honor. Thornton nodded once, then stepped past him, leaving the courtroom. As Ethan turned, he spotted James Holloway slipping out the side exit. The once mighty attorney, who had begun this trial with arrogance and certainty, now looked like a man who had lost everything. Ethan didn't feel sorry for him. He had chosen his side, and today, the court had reminded him that justice always had the final say. As he gathered his things, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found Rachel Monroe, the forensic accountant, smiling at him. You ever consider switching to financial crime full-time? She asked. Ethan smirked. I think I just got a crash course. She laughed. You did more than that. You exposed corruption in open court. That doesn't happen every day. Ethan nodded. Maybe it should. As he stepped out of the courtroom, the sun was setting beyond the courthouse steps. The air was crisp, the city alive with motion. Today, justice had spoken, and Ethan Carter was just getting started. The steps of the courthouse were buzzing with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward as voices clamored for a statement. The air carried the scent of anticipation. Justice had been served, but the world wanted to hear it spoken aloud. Ethan Carter adjusted his tie, stepping down from the courthouse doors with Daniel Lewis beside him. Just days ago, he had walked into this court mocked, dismissed as an inexperienced nobody. Now, every journalist in town wanted to hear what he had to say. A reporter, a woman with sharp eyes and a microphone bearing the logo of a major news network, called out, Mr. Carter, how does it feel to have taken down one of the most powerful corporate figures in the state? Ethan paused, considering his words. This case was never about taking anyone down, he said evenly. It was about standing up for truth, for justice, and for people who refuse to be silenced. The court saw through the lies. That's all that matters. Another journalist jumped in. What do you say to those who claim you embarrassed the legal system by turning a simple lawsuit into a criminal takedown? Ethan's expression remained calm. The courtroom isn't a place for convenience. It's a place for truth. The evidence spoke for itself, and the court did what it was meant to do: hold people accountable, no matter how powerful they think they are. Daniel, still in disbelief at the attention, whispered, Are they always this aggressive? Ethan smirked. Only when they smell a scandal. Before more questions could fly, a voice called from behind. Carter. Ethan turned to see Special Agent Daniel Monroe approaching, his badge clipped to his belt, his stride carrying the weight of federal authority. The crowd of reporters instinctively backed away. Monroe extended a hand, which Ethan shook firmly. Nice work in there. Appreciate that, Agent Monroe, Ethan said. What's next for Winston? Monroe exhaled sharply. Indictments are already being processed. The court did its part. Now it's our turn. He'll be facing multiple charges: fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. This is just the beginning. Daniel let out a low whistle. Guess he won't be filing any more lawsuits anytime soon. Monroe smirked. Not unless it's to appeal his conviction. He turned back to Ethan. You ever think about stepping over to our side? We could use lawyers who can handle themselves in a courtroom like you did today. Ethan chuckled. Appreciate the offer, but I think I like fighting my battles from the other side of the bench. Monroe nodded. Fair enough. Just know that you've made a lot of enemies today. Winston wasn't operating alone. People like him never do. Ethan's expression didn't change, but he understood the warning. Winning in court didn't mean the war was over. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. Monroe gave him a knowing look before walking away. Daniel turned to Ethan. "So what now?" Ethan glanced at the courthouse behind them, then at the city stretching beyond. "Now," he smiled slightly, "now I go home and get some sleep." Daniel laughed. "That's it? You just took down one of the biggest corporate fraudsters in the country, and you're calling it a night?" Ethan shrugged. "Court's done for today. But there'll be another case tomorrow. There always is." With that, he stepped off the courthouse steps, blending into the city crowd. He didn't need the cameras, the headlines, or the spotlight. The courtroom had spoken, and that was enough. Justice isn't about power, it's about truth. Today, the courtroom proved that no one is above the law. What did you think of this case? Do you believe justice was truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, tell us where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing how far our community reaches. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping courtroom dramas, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a case that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.